Well, thanks for coming out this evening, everybody, and thanks to the Palestine Museum volunteers for inviting me. Like Patrick said, I am a writer, journalist for a website headquartered in Chicago in the US called the Electronic Intifada. I'll just say, before I start, just say a brief word about us. We're an independent website, independent news website organisation, which is, we don't receive any corporate funding, we don't have any advertising, we don't have any state sponsors, we don't have any oil or gas money behind us. We are funded by our readers. So we literally run fundraisers at Christmas time and during the course of the year. We have regular contributors. So we're a genuinely independent, reader-supported media organisation. And it means that I'm lucky enough to be able to professionally do what I do and write about Palestine. We have contributors all over the world because Palestine is a global issue. So we have Palestinians, writers in Gaza, in the West Bank, in the 1948 territories, and around the world, in the US, in different countries. We've got a correspondent in Brussels. I'm based in London, so I tend to write about the British government's support for Israel, for Israeli policies, and in recent years, quite a lot about what's been termed Israel's covert influence campaign in this country. So I'm going to talk a little bit about that in the second half of my talk. So I'm going to be talking a fair amount of details. So if you want to learn about the sources where you can read more and sort of see the evidence for some of the things that I'm saying tonight, you can ask me afterwards or sort of raise it in the Q&A. I've got a list of sources with me. So, you know, you can read more about that. A large part of what I say in the second half of the talk is based actually on my own reporting on the Electronic Intifada. So it's, a lot of you probably already know it. It's electronicintifada.net. Okay, so I'll start with the Nakba. So Tuesday next week, the 15th of May, marks the 70th anniversary of what the Palestinian people term Yom al-Nakba, or the Day of Catastrophe in Arabic. The Nakba is the defining event that formed and solidified the Palestinian liberation struggle. Between 1947 and 1948, more than 750,000 Palestinians, about half of the Arab population at that time, were forced out of Palestine at the barrel of a gun by the Zionist militias that subsequently formed the basis of the Israeli army. As part of this calculated act of ethnic cleansing, these militias dynamited and bulldozed 531 Palestinian villages in an attempt to ensure the refugees would never return. Unlike what happens after most other wars, the Palestinian refugees were systematically denied their right to return to their homeland, Palestine. Today, these refugees and their descendants number at least 5.2 million people in the Gaza Strip, West Bank, and the surrounding Arab countries, and that's according to UN figures. That's UN registered refugees, and so the true figure is actually higher than that. The State of Israel was unilaterally declared by the Zionist movement in British-occupied Palestine on the 14th of May, 1948. So this is the 70th anniversary next week. In long debunked Israeli and Western mythology, the narrative was that Israel was a sort of brave little Goliath, brave little David to the Arab Goliath, and only wanted to live in peace with its neighbours, but that the new state was invaded and provoked on the next day, on the 15th of May, 1948. But the historical reality is very different, and you know, there's been a lot of work over the last few decades that has really kind of changed a lot of people's perceptions about this. In terms of historians, that narrative is really pretty widely discredited now, although Israel's most sort of ardent defenders still cling on to it. The truth is that by the time that some Arab states reluctantly intervened on the 15th of May 1948, the Zionist militias, Haganah, Igun and Nechai, had been involved in a systematic campaign of ethnic cleansing, expelling the indigenous Palestinian Arab population from the country as much as they possibly could. As shown by the Israeli historian Ilan Pappé in his seminal book the ethnic cleansing of Palestine, almost 250,000 Palestinians had already been expelled by the 14th of May, 1948, before the Arab armies intervened. So, ethnic cleansing was already underway. The Israeli narrative, therefore, in this regard, is essentially a lie. So that's just a very brief historical sketch of what the Nakba means and why it's so central to the Palestinian story and what has happened in the last 70 years. This is the central injustice at the heart of what is called the conflict, the so-called Israeli-Palestinian conflict. And I think that's really kind of an inaccurate way to understand it. Essentially, this is a historical injustice that happened and that is still ongoing, as Alicia mentioned, and is something that has never been dealt with. So to learn more about the details of what happened in 1940, I recommend reading Ian Pepe's book. It's a very good book. He's a very thorough historian, but it's also quite a readable account. You know, there's a lot of good works by historians about. There's a lot of there's no end of books about Palestine. A lot of them are quite sort of dry and academic, but the ethnic cleansing of Palestine is a very readable account. I mean, it's not an easy read, not a fun read, because it deals with ethnic cleansing, obviously, but it's something that is readable, I would say, and understandable. And there's another book as well called, another seminal text called Expulsion of the Palestinians, from the 1990s, an earlier book by the brilliant Palestinian scholar Nakba Salha, which shows the background of the ideology of transfer in the political thought of the Zionist movement that led up to 1948. So both of those books are largely based on declassified Israeli government documents in the original Hebrew, but also draw on Palestinian and other Arab primary sources. Ilan Pepe is an Israeli Jewish academic, but he's pro-Palestinian. He's that anti-Zionist politically. Nakba Salha is a Palestinian citizen of Israel, so he understands the Hebrew as well. So why do these historical events still matter today? Why have we come out in Bristol for an evening about something that happened 70 years ago? Primarily because of one simple fact. The Palestinian refugees have still not been allowed to return home 70 years later. So the Palestinian refugee camps have gone from tents to shanty towns to essentially, for example, in Damascus in Syria, the Nakba refugee camp, the Yarmouk refugee camp is almost a suburb of Damascus. But I was just hearing on Radio 4 this morning a report from Gaza of a very young woman. She must have been a teenager or in her early 20s. She would have been born in the Gaza Strip to the descendant of refugees who were kicked out of probably Ashkelon, what is now the Israeli Al-Majdal, what has now been termed by the Israelis Ashkelon. And she said, sorry, no, that's not right, she's not from there because of what she subsequently said. But the point is, she would have been born to refugees, and she's never been to what is now called Israel because of the Israeli occupation. But she didn't say I'm from Gaza, she said I'm from Jaffa, which is now sort of a suburb. It was originally a Palestinian city, but has now kind of been taken over by Tel Aviv. And that shows, the fact that she said, I'm from Jaffa, though she's never been to Jaffa, shows like the historical memory, the active historical memory of Palestinian refugees, that it's very much a living thing for them. They've never been allowed to return. They've been systematically blocked from returning to Palestine by the State of Israel, with the support of their backers in the West. That's the main reason. There's never been a right of return. Secondly, because as outlined by Joseph Massad, probably the world's foremost Palestinian intellectual and academic, the Nakba is not merely a historical event, but it's an ongoing process. The best way to think of it, Joseph Massad said, is that it's an ongoing process. And we're actually about to publish an article by Joseph Massad in the Electronic Intifada for the anniversary of the Nakba called The Future of the Nakba. And he's talking about how you can sketch some of the outlines of where Israel will go with what can be termed the ongoing Nakba. The ranks of Palestinian refugees and the internally displaced are added to year after year and decade after decade thanks to the ongoing process of Israeli ethnic cleansing. Many Palestinian villages and neighbourhoods today, such as in the West Bank and in the south of present-day Israel, are systematically targeted by Israeli occupation forces for demolition on spurious pretexts. In their place are built settlements which are either exclusively or predominantly for Jewish Israeli settlers alone. The Nakba is thus an ongoing process of ethnic cleansing and a daily reality for Palestinians. It's not merely an isolated historical event. But the Palestinian people have never given up hope and have continued to struggle against the Nakba for 7 decades now. Today, more than 1.3 million UN-registered refugees live in the Gaza Strip alone, which is one of the world's most densely populated territories. The total population there has reached now almost 2 million people. For the past 7 weeks, a massive popular movement of unarmed demonstrations has marched on the Israeli military's occupation fence along the Gaza boundary line, demanding their right to return home to Palestine as it was before 1948. The marches have successfully brought the plight of the Palestinian refugees back to the world's attention, but at the cost of an Israeli massacre of Palestinian civilians, as they knew would happen. As of last week, I didn't get a chance to see if there was any further killings today, because there was a demonstration also today.
There have been.
How many more?
I'm not sure, but I have seen a picture of a boy. It's really terrible one. Yeah.
And so as of last week, it was 40 Palestinians who were killed by Israeli soldiers in the course of these protests. And I've just learned there's been more today, with thousands more injured. And they've been deliberately targeted by snipers. 2 of the dead Palestinians were journalists and 5 were children, including the 14-year-old named Mahmoud Ibrahim Ayoub. A reservist Israeli brigadier general called Zvika Fogel confirmed in an interview on Israeli radio a week or 2 ago that the army had deliberately targeted Palestinian children who were protesting with its snipers. According to Fogel, he said that for a Palestinian, quote, child or anyone else, unquote, who gets near the Gaza occupation fence, in his words, he said, his punishment is death. Despite the Israeli army's propaganda, pumped out on social and mainstream media alike, that the protesters are so-called violent rioters, not a single Israeli has been reported injured, let alone killed. In a swiftly deleted tweet, the Israeli military claimed that, quote, everything was accurate and measured and we know where every bullet landed. As such, that's the end of the quote, as such the Israeli military admitted to premeditated war crimes against an unarmed civilian population, an unarmed civilian demonstration which was protesting for a basic human right, the right to return to your home after a war. And yet, Western leaders are either silent about these murders or actively supportive. Our Foreign Minister, Boris Johnson, said nothing, while his deputy at the Foreign Office issued an appalling statement. Alistair Burt said in a statement, which you can read on the Foreign Office website, and he sort of fretted about mysterious and attributed, quote, deaths and injuries on the Israel/Gaza border, unquote, while claiming that there was an, quote, urgent need to establish the facts, including why such a volume of live fire was used and what role Hamas played in the violence. So it's kind of this, this is sort of narrative that you see quite often, that, well, they just sort of died while they were approaching the fence as if it was some sort of mysterious natural event. This statement by Alistair Burt, in my opinion, was a transparent attempt to propagandise for Israel. Even the Israeli army had made no claim that Palestinian armed groups, which do exist, were firing at them from the demonstrations. That simply hadn't happened, and even the Israeli army had not claimed that. But sort of Alistair Burt was trying to not claim, but sort of intimate that maybe it happened and maybe it was justified that these children and protesters had been killed, shot dead with snipers. So that's the British government, the Tories. And what of the opposition Labour Party? So while the opposition leader, Jeremy Corbyn, he did condemn the killings and he did sort of condemn Western silence, he stopped short of calling for any practical measure to hold Israel accountable, unfortunately. Notably, he said nothing about an arms embargo on Israel. An arms embargo is a policy he once supported, and I interviewed him back in 2015 when he was first running for the Labour Party leader, and he did call for a two-way arms embargo. We haven't heard anything about that in recent times. And it's partly because his shadow foreign minister, Emily Thornberry, who's a supporter of Labour Friends of Israel, has expressed opposition to any form of boycott of Israel, and has said that we need to understand the Israelis need to be armed, words to that effect, in an interview with the Middle East Eye website. Jeremy Corbyn did later call for a review of British arms sales to Israel, but this is, in my opinion, this is really not good enough. It's really far short of the arms embargo that is really needed. A review is kind of face-saving move, and I think what people sometimes forget is that there was a review. There was a previous review of British arms sales to Israel, and Gordon Brown actually, and when no less than David Miliband, who's very much on the right wing of the Labour Party, who's sort of left for this job in New York now, for this very high-paid job in New York. Even David Miliband did a review of Israeli arms sales to Israel during the so-called Cast-Lead offensive, or soon after the Cast-Lead offensive in 2010. They did this kind of review, and they tried to look like they were doing something. Things died down, and everything sort of went back to normal. Nothing really changed. So, in my opinion, a review of British arms sales to Israel is not good enough. It's a smokescreen. So all this is, is pretty discouraging. What can we do? So I'll talk a little bit about that. There is, as was mentioned, something called the BDS movement, which I'm sure most of you know about. In 2005, the largest coalition of Palestinian civil society founded the Boycott, Divestment and Sanctions Movement, or the BDS movement. They united around the three central demands of the Palestinian liberation struggle, the only demands on which there is a complete national consensus of the Palestinian people as a whole. They called for BDS to be imposed on Israel until it complies with the following three demands. Number one, ends its occupation and colonization of all Arab lands, so Gaza Strip and the West Bank, as well as the Syrian Golan Heights, which is also occupied by Israel, and small sections of southern Lebanon still occupied by Israel. Number two, recognises the fundamental rights of the Arab Palestinian citizens of Israel to full equality. The Palestinians of 1948, Palestinian citizens of Israel, although nominally citizens, are not equal. There's about 50 laws that discriminate against them. They don't have equal rights. Number three, the third demand of BDS is respecting, protecting and promoting the rights of Palestinian refugees to return to their homes and properties as stipulated in UN Resolution 194. So as a sort of aside, one of the kind of propaganda narratives against BDS is, we don't know what it stands for. But this is nonsense, because those have been very clear demands since the beginning, which is very simply end to occupation, full equality, right of return. Very simple. The BDS movement is today the primary way that we in the West can show practical solidarity with Palestinians and pressure our leaders to reverse their policies of support for Israel. And you can tell that BDS has been having an effect on Israel over the last 13 years now. I'm going to talk now for some of the reasons we know about that. The State of Israel considers the BDS movement to be such a threat to their policies of oppression that it has now devoted an entire multi-million-dollar ministry to combating it. It does this through a mixture of crude online propaganda, sort of bot farms and commenting online, and anytime I write an article you get all these comments which are, they're trying to look sort of organic, but they're obviously orchestrated. I mean, Israel's not unique in this regard. A lot of states do this, but Israel's definitely involved in it as well. Backroom lobbying efforts which pressure Western countries to outlaw BDS, and an increasingly dirty covert influence and sabotage campaign. This so-called this ministry is called the Ministry of Strategic Affairs, It's been around for quite a few years, and it used to primarily deal with Iran, but once the Iran deal came in, it changed, and its focus since 2015 has been BDS. It's been essentially the anti-BDS ministry, although it's still called the Ministry of Strategic Affairs. And Israel calls it its war against BDS. Those are its terms. They actually use these very warlike terms, and the military terminology is no accident. The leaders of the semi-covert campaign increasingly see themselves as, in the words of a journalist from the Israeli newspaper Haaretz, quote, a place whose internal terminology comes from the world of espionage and security. Its leading figures appear to see themselves as their heads of a public affairs commando unit engaged in multiple fronts. And according to another Israeli journalist, the veteran security correspondent Yossi Melman, the ministry is involved in what he calls black ops against the movement for justice in Palestine. These have included such dirty tricks as a campaign of harassment and death threats against Nadia Kiswanson, a Palestinian attorney with the human rights group Al-Haq. They did this because Al-Haq has been collecting evidence of Israeli war crimes in Gaza to submit to the International Criminal Court in The Hague. One of the first acts of the Strategic Affairs Minister, Gilad Erdan, when he took over as Strategic Affairs Minister, was to recruit a new Director General to run his ministry on a day-to-day basis, sort of civil servant. Her name is Sima Vaknin-Gil, and she was once a top-ranking Israeli military intelligence officer. For more than 20 years, she worked as a spy for Israeli Air Force intelligence, rising to the rank of Brigadier General, a position she, in fact, still holds today as a reservist. So it's a very aggressive situation where you've got somebody who is essentially a spy for a foreign government who's operating a global campaign of sabotage, what has been called by a key Israeli think tank, which I'll talk about in a bit, a campaign of sabotage by a spy agency against BDS, which is, at base, is a completely peaceful, non-violent form of resistance, of campaigning, you know. All we're saying to people is, don't buy this. It's not, you know, there's no, they have these sort of elevated terms for it, where it's been called the most outlandish things, like economic terrorism. You know, so it's a kind of bizarre overreaction in a way, but it shows that they consider BDS a sort of a moral threat to them in that sense. Soon after she was appointed as the Director General, she told the gathering in Tel Aviv, I want to create a community of fighters. She said she planned to, quote, flood the internet, unquote, with Israeli propaganda that would be publicly distanced from the government. A large part of the ministry's operations are classified and has been pushing to raise the secrecy further by exempting themselves from Israeli freedom of information law in the same way as the Mossad and Shin Bet spy agencies, which are notorious for assassinations, kidnapping, torture. Sima Vaknin-Gil once told, in September 2016, she told Israel's parliament that, quote, we want most of the ministry's work to be classified. A major part of what we do stays under the radar. Erdan has also admitted his ministry's use of international front groups, historically a common tool for Israeli spy agencies. He said in 2017 that, quote, most of the ministry's actions are not of the ministry, but through bodies around the world who do not want to expose their connection with the state, front groups. A rival government ministry in 2016 accused Erdan's group of, quote, operating British Jewish organisations behind the embassy's back in a way that could put them in violation of British law, according to the Israeli liberal newspaper Haaretz. So one example of this has come to light, but only because the Qatari satellite channel Al Jazeera undertook a seminal 6-month undercover investigation into the UK's Israel lobby. So, you know, full disclosure, I'm one of the talking heads in that film, so I'm naturally going to, you know, like it. But I do think it is genuinely a really important film. That film was called The Lobby. It was broadcast in January last year, still available on YouTube. It exposed the operations of an Israeli embassy spy called Shai Massot. As you may know, Massot was forced to leave the UK after his plot to, quote, take down Alan Duncan, the Conservative minister, and senior Conservative minister, actually, basically Boris Johnson's number 2 of the Foreign Office, and other MPs and ministers who were deemed critical of Israel in some way, you know, even mildly critical of Israel. That was exposed in the film, you know, became a kind of scandal for a few days. The guy was thrown under the bus by the ambassador and he was forced to go back to Tel Aviv. You may remember that story, but if you watch the full 4-part film, which I highly recommend, it's very good, most of it actually focused on Israel's covert influence campaign inside the Labour Party. Although Gilad Erdan, the minister, denied it, all the evidence revealed in the film and in a document I later obtained and wrote about at the Electronic Intifada pointed towards Shai Mossad being an operative of this same Ministry of Strategic Affairs, the anti-BDS ministry. Mossad seemed to focus most of his attention on the Labour Party. The film exposed the intimacy of the Israeli embassy in London with groups which we can now confidently and accurately, in my opinion, describe as front groups or proxy organisations within the Labour Party for the Embassy of Israel. And these are namely Labour Friends of Israel and the Jewish Labour Movement. In undercover footage broadcast in the Al Jazeera film, LFI, Labour Friends of Israel's parliamentary officer, a young guy named Michael Rubin, he spoke about the Israeli embassy and he admitted that, this is a series of quotes, they're all his quotes, I've stitched them together, but these are all his own words. We do work really, really closely together. It's just publicly, we just try to keep the LFI as a separate identity to the embassy. Being LFI allows us to reach out to people who wouldn't want to get involved with the embassy. Keeping it as a separate thing is actually best for everyone. It's a front organisation, basically. He also admitted that Joan Ryan, who's the MP, Labour MP, who basically is the public face of LFI, although she doesn't run it day to day, she admitted that Joan Ryan, and who's notably been a very vocal critic of Jeremy Corbyn, accusing him of anti-Semitism and all sorts. Joan Ryan spoke to this Israeli embassy spy, Shai Mossad, on, quote, most days, according to Michael Rubin. The film shows Rubin admitting he had secured funding from Mossad and from the Israeli embassy to help establish a group called Young Labour Friends of Israel, a sort of youth wing. This plan seems to have collapsed after it was exposed in the film, primarily because the person who was supposed to be running it was the undercover Al Jazeera journalist. A transcript of an undercover recording that we at the Electronic Intifada recently obtained, and which I wrote about last month, shows that the Jewish Labour Movement too is essentially a proxy for the Israeli embassy. This is an even more insidious aspect of this, in my opinion. Because a group like Labour Friends of Israel, you might kind of guess, has got links to the Israeli embassy. Jewish Labour Movement is actually presenting itself as a legitimate voice of the Jewish community. So it's kind of it's a really dangerous line. The JLM is in my analysis and in my reporting, and I've written about this more and more recently, is essentially a proxy for the Israeli embassy. The group's national director, Ella Rose, this is the person who runs it on a day-to-day basis, admitted to Al Jazeera's undercover report in 2016 that, quote, we work with Shai, we know him very well, referring to the same disgraced spy who was sent back to Tel Aviv. As I revealed back in September 2016, Ella Rose had previously been the Israeli embassy's public affairs officer. But the newly re-established JLM is not a 100-year-old group as it claims to be. It was moribund and has now recently been re-established. I'm going to write about this more soon. The newly re-established JLM recruited her to run their group. The transcript of the conversation proves that her relationship with the embassy continued after she became JLM director, and almost certainly continues today. So when I say that these groups are front organisations, doesn't mean they don't have their own independent life, okay? It's not a simple like master and puppet relationship. It's a bit more sophisticated than that. But there's no doubt that they act under at least partly under directions and at least advice of the Israeli embassy. If you look at the JLM's key role in fueling the false and smearing narrative that Labour under Jeremy Corbyn is now an institutionally anti-Semitic party, something I've written about quite a lot, it's not hard to see what the Israeli embassy's goal has been, which is, in my analysis, division and confusion. So, just to conclude, I mean, all this is kind of what I write about professionally, and I kind of get into the ins and outs of it. But I think we have to keep things in perspective a bit, and all this kind of talk of covert action, backroom plots, It can be quite intimidating. And actually, they do want to present themselves as powerful, as more powerful than they are, because it can make us think, hang on, I'm going to get in trouble here if I say anything, or do anything, or protest on the street, or say something in my CLP meeting in the Labour Party. There's a real fear there within the Labour Party, I can tell you from talking to people, from activists. So I'd like to conclude with a few words of hope. The very fact that this spy, Shai Mossad, focused so much on Labour and the Labour Party is actually a sign, in my opinion, of the Israel lobby's inherent weaknesses. Yeah, it's true that it's very well funded, it's got a large amount of support at the top echelons of political power. The film infamously showed Mossad boasting to LFI's Joan Ryan that he'd secured £1 million, more than £1 million in funding for MPs to visit Israel on a propaganda junket. But as Mossad himself admits in the film, although most new Tory MPs today automatically join the Conservative Friends of Israel, new Labour MPs are no longer doing that for LFI. In the past they were, especially under people like Tony Blair, they were. No, that's not the case at all today. This is simply because Israel's brutal actions against the Palestinians means it's increasingly seen even by some of its most previously ardent supporters as a toxic brand. People who, like for example, Natalie Portman, liberal Zionist person, student of Alan Dershowitz, famous Hollywood actress, very vocal support of Israel from a sort of liberal Zionist perspective in the past. She recently refused to accept an award in Israel because Israel is shooting down Palestinian children on the boundary with Gaza. It's too toxic even for her. Historically speaking, if you look at the long-term trends, the Israel lobby's influence is in sharp decline. The power of the Israel lobby is in large part a paper tiger. A secret Israeli government-backed report by a key think tank last year admitted as much. They, despite the fact that pro-Israel groups, they said, have increased their spending to combat the BDS and other forms of solidarity with Palestine by over 20 times in the previous 6 years. In their words, results remain elusive, which is a kind of wonky think tank way to say we're getting nowhere here. We at the Electronic Intifada obtained and published that report just over a year ago. In it, the think tank called the Reut Institute, an influential Israeli think tank, which the report actually contains an endorsement by the same woman, Simon Vatnin-Gill, the Director General of the Anti-BDS Ministry. The report admits that the BDS movement has seen, quote, impressive growth and, quote, significant successes. This is the same think tank that 8 years ago published a notorious strategy document, a series of strategy documents, which outline the ways that the Israeli government should combat BDS and other forms of solidarity with Palestine. And in their words, intelligence forces, Israeli organizations, Israeli government institutions should act against it by, quote, sabotage and attack. They later removed this from their website, but we had a copy of it, we published it. So sabotage and attack has been their strategy for the last 8 years, at least, The same group admits now in private that it's losing this battle, and this is because they see it as a war, on a battlefield. But the truth is, if it's a battle, it's a moral battle. So it's a battle between, of course there's complications, doesn't mean that everything Palestinians do is right, of course not, but it's essentially a battle between right and wrong, a moral battle. And when these debates are had openly and without the intimidation of these kind of strategies, they know they can't win honest arguments. And the fact that they're losing this moral battle is thanks to the actions of ordinary people like you, and like me. The movement for Palestinian liberation and our solidarity with it is a global struggle for basic human rights. The right to live free of a military occupation, the right to live in full equality and not be discriminated against just because you're an Arab in a so-called Jewish state, and the right of return of refugees to return to their homes. Those are basic human rights. Such popular movements are led by normal people and can ultimately force politicians to sit up and take notice. as the struggle against apartheid in South Africa proved. So that means it's up to all of us to make a difference. Thank you very much for listening to me tonight. Thank you for coming out. And